So there's this Protestant minister who told me this story, and I believe this story only because he is so reputable. He's really a good person. And he tells a story that before he was working in a church, he worked a couple years as a chaplain in a hospital. And he told the story that once his child was born, and after the birth, they found out the child has Down syndrome. And this doctor talks to the family because I guess the child needed some easy medical procedure, and without it, it wouldn't live. And the doctor says to the family, it may be best just to let nature take its course because, the child won't have his type of life. And the parents looked at each other stunned, and they said, no, he'll be in a family of love. And so that was it. They leave the room, and the doctor then says to the chaplain, he says, you need to make them hear the voice of the voice of reason. And the chaplain, this Protestant minister, said, I think they have different reasons than you do, and I think they hear a different voice than the one you're hearing. And I thought that was just a great reply. The doctor, God bless him, but unless you have his kind of very safe, easy life, then life isn't worth it. The family, they heard a different voice that changed their reasoning. This child will be enfolded into a family of love, will know and give love. They did work by a completely different reason and voice. And I just say that because in today's readings, it's really about, can you hear the voice of the shepherd? That Christ the shepherd, he's the voice, and he speaks not just to us Christians. Christ is the divine shepherd that speaks to all people. And I like that idea that Christ is calling us, and a true Christian is not one who, it's not what they say. It's not whether they memorize the Bible or know the catechism. A true Christian, in this definition, is somebody who can hear the voice of the shepherd and is always calling us. And so to really become a true shepherd, a follower of Christ, you have to train yourself to hear that voice. It's training. And how do you train yourself? You train yourself through prayer. I like the word meditation. You train yourself through meditation so that you can hear the shepherd's voice. Like on meditations, we have the rosary. Actually, in the Catholic Church, we have hundreds of different types of meditation. And one that I personally think everybody should practice is St. Ignatius's Examen, where every day you look for the presence of God in your daily life. Because people don't learn from experience. People learn from reflecting on experience. If you're wondering how to do the Examen, it's on our website. But you look how every day you can find the presence of Christ. That trains us to hear the voice of Christ. Or in the Gospel of John, when Jesus speaks about the bread of life, he speaks about the bread of life, the Eucharist, as a training session to hear the will of God. So, yes, it takes training. But when Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, I really didn't know this until a couple years ago. Sheep actually can distinguish the voice of their shepherd. I asked a sheep expert in our parish, I said, is that really true? Because I heard the story of this Bedouin who was on a bicycle, and he was calling out to his sheep, and all the sheep were following right after him. They took a trip to the Holy Land, and this person was a Basque, and Basque know sheep, said, yeah, they can actually hear your voice. I'm just usually think, like, dogs always come. Actually, my mother, when I was growing up, had a cat, and when she would call the cat, before we went to bed, she'd call the cat, and the cat would come running when it heard her voice, and then, like, when it got about 3 feet away, it would stop and then look away from her. And my mother would have to walk that 3 feet and grab the cat. I just loved its attitude. the species that should really be able to hear the voice of God is us. It does take training, and it's not just Christians who hear it. Christ calls out to everybody. And so I love that image that, we hear the voice of God, and where does it lead? Well, yes, to the will of God, but also the second reading, one of my favorites, is the image of the Lamb of God, the feast of the Lamb of God. And in the book of Revelation, that's where everything leads to, is the feast of the Lamb of God. And I could actually give like a 4-day lecture on the Lamb of God. I love it. I think people would get upset, but real quick, the Lamb of God, you could say the entire Bible talks about the Lamb of God. Starts with Abraham. And the Lamb of God is what's going to save the family of God. Except the Lamb of God hasn't come yet. Then you have Moses. And Moses, they're slaves in Egypt. They're slaves, and what's going to free them, oddly enough, is the Lamb of God. And think about this. God says to him, I am sending the destroyer, the most powerful destructive force in the world, death, over the land of Egypt. You take the blood of the Lamb of God, you put it on your doorpost, you eat it, and the destroyer will pass over you. And then God says this strange part. He says, don't go out that night. The destroyer won't care if you're Hebrew or Egyptian. The only thing more powerful is the Lamb of God. That you have to smear the blood and eat it, and then death can't touch you. I just think it's funny that Egypt at the time was this most powerful military force, strongest economic force, and what's going to free these slaves is Fluffy, the lamb. And there's nothing more, gentle and meek than a baby lamb. Now, the Lamb of God would free them that year, but humanity's still waiting for the Lamb of God that would free all humanity and bring us together. So that's why, if you're wondering, Jews blow this shofar. It's a ram's horn. When they blow it, it's a call to prayer, but when they blow it, it's actually two things. One, it's a call to God to remember, you promised to send us the Lamb of God that would free us and gather us all together. God hadn't done it yet. So the shofar is blown, so it reminds God. The shofar is blown so that you can hear the call of the shepherd to come and pray. And finally, the Lamb of God shows up in the gospel where John says, behold the Lamb of God, and points to Christ. And then when you get to the very end of the Bible, you get this view of heaven. And what is heaven but the feast of the Lamb of God? And there's where the true feast is. On the altar, you have the Lamb, and then you have, billions of people and angels and seraphims gathered together of every, as it says, race, language, and way of life. All those who heard the voice of the shepherd, it leads to this great feast of love, the Lamb of God. So we would say, well, it takes practice to behold the Lamb of God. You hear that voice, and ultimately it'll lead to the great feast of the Lamb of God. And so, we would say, we want to attune ourselves so that we can hear that voice. So go back to the doctor. I think either you're hearing the voice of the shepherd or you're hearing your own voices of fear or selfishness. Either Christ is shepherding you and feeding you, or it's some other thing. The doctor, God bless him, but the voice he hears really is very selfish. And he'll probably end up, I hope not, but probably end up just by himself. The family, they hear a different voice that calls them to be part of this family of love. On the Feast of the Good Shepherd, and that's what this is called, either you hear the voice of the shepherd or you're hearing other voices. One leads to destruction, the other one to the great feast of the Lamb of God. Let's train ourselves. And so together, let us stand and profess our faith.